Okay, so we're getting started now. First and foremost, thank you everyone for committing to being with us for the next 4 Saturdays, counting today. Again, it's really exciting and amazing to be able to connect with comrades all over. My name is Claudia de la Cruz, and I'm connecting from New York City. I'm one of the coordinators of this 4-part series on fascism and the global struggle.
Hey, comrades, it's great to see all of you. Thank you for joining the class. I'll be presenting here in a moment, so I won't say much more about myself other than that I'm in the Philadelphia branch. And I'm excited about this series and very excited to collaborate with all the comrades who have contributed. Claudia, David, Marissa, but then a lot of people behind the scenes as well. Brian, Andrew, Walter, and many, many other comrades. So it's a collective endeavor, and I'm really proud and honored to have the opportunity to speak to everyone about fascism today.
Thank you, David and Gabriel. And I just want to encourage folks, if you haven't done so yet, feel free to write where you are connecting from and your name so that other comrades are able also to know who's in this virtual room with us. So in the tradition of liberation theology and popular education and social movements, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, we want to offer us a space of grounding, which is called Mystica. And Mystica is a leftist and revolutionary tradition, again, particularly from Latin America and the Caribbean, and is uplifting ways to show what our spirit of struggle is. And some of you may already be in connection with what that is, but moments where we put forth song, poetry, theater pieces that are able to show the contradictions of the system, but also able to show and move people towards the radical imagination for the future, which is highly needed. And so we're gonna start with some Mystica, and my comrade David is going to help with that.
What's your definition of fascist?
I would say, to me, the essence of fascism in two things. Let's take the more obvious one first. Racial superiority. The kind of racial superiority that led a Hitler to wipe out 6 million Jewish people, that can result any day in the lynching of Negro people in the South or other parts of America, the denial of their rights, the constant daily denial to any Negro in America, no matter how important, whoever it may be, of his essential human dignity, the thing which no other American would accept. This daily insult to his dignity as a human being. This is the essence of fascism. Now the second thing is, but the most important thing, which is the reason this can be, is the power of the resources of a nation in the hands of the few, and the use of the state power, as Hitler or Mussolini or the police in Kansas City, to beat down any attempt to strive toward any kind of democratic rights or freedoms.
Even though that be law enforcement?
We find always that law enforcement in this case is the protection of the property of the few people who are the potential of fascism.
Thank you for sharing that, David. And I hope folks enjoyed it. As comrades were mentioning on the chat, that was definitely our comrade Paul Robeson speaking truth. And our comrade Peggy Seeger, who is the half sister of another Seeger that we should all know. So we're going to move on with this session. We're going to share as much as we can in terms of songs and poetry of the different times of struggle and response also to fascism, but also, the other connections that it has to capitalism, imperialism, and the world's misery. We're very excited to have the space again to engage in the collective construction of knowledge and engage in discussions on the very, very relevant topic of fascism, and also the historic lessons on how to fight back, which is very key to all our work. As we all know, we have been living a convergence of crisis, economic, political, and social, environmental, a crisis that has been accelerated and deepened by the COVID pandemic globally, with new and unprecedented levels of inequality and exploitation worldwide, the deepening of the economic crisis, the legitimizing of neoliberal projects, the rise of fascist leaders, there are many challenges to our organizing, but we also have to identify what the opportunities are to intensify the struggle and strengthen the party and our organizing efforts. But in order to advance this unity, it's necessary to arrive at a common reading of the current context, to study and learn more about the limitations and weaknesses of the capitalist system and how to take advantage of these fissures in our current context. That is why we are doing this 4-part series course, why it is important not only to participate in this space, but more importantly, to be able to engage and study and popularize it. I'm hoping that folks are familiar with that term, popularizing, but making it an ordinary conversation in the most ordinary of the spaces. That's our task as revolutionaries. And so again, we're thankful for everyone to be here. We know that historically, moments of deep crisis have also meant moments in which the bourgeoisie have reorganized themselves to guarantee the continuation of capitalism. We also understand the deep and prolonged crisis that we are in. And this brings the resurgence of fascist elements, which means a greater imperialist offensive and also more repression and violence, both domestically and internationally. And so with that said, I'm going to give space for Gabriel to do the presentation for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudia, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor. I did want to insist before I begin that this is very much a collaborative effort, as I mentioned just briefly. What I'll be presenting is my own kind of research on the history of fascism, but of course this comes out of my activism and a lot of the political education that we've been doing in the Philly branch. And we conceive of this series as really a series in which we are all thinking through these issues. And so we want questions, we want feedback, we want criticism, and we want to really uplift all of us together so that we can work through these difficult issues and try to tackle them as much as possible. The presentation that I have is divided into distinct sections just to kind of keep people on track. And so I'll read them as I go. And the first section is the question of definitions. One of the primary questions that comrades who are registered wanted addressed in this series is, what is fascism? And more specifically, as John from Springfield phrased it, how do we define fascism in 2021? Now, in order to address both this general and this more specific question, however, a brief theoretical detour is necessary in order to clarify how historical materialists approach the question of definitions, and more precisely, definitions of key concepts in struggle like fascism. Now, I don't want comrades who are unfamiliar with theory to be turned off by this, including those who might have very little schooling or who might not have excelled in the bourgeois indoctrination camps they were subjected to under the name of education. Theory, properly explained and collectively articulated through communist pedagogy, should not be intimidating or threatening. Between comrades, it should be recognized as a form of empowerment that allows us to tap into the collective insights of past revolutionaries, learn from their struggles, and gain greater clarity regarding the nature of the material world and the struggle to transform it. Marx wrote the following, quote, "The weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism by weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force, but theory becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses," end quote. The goal of communist pedagogy, and in many ways this series then, is to mobilize the use value of theory for the masses of humanity in order to transform the social order. Historical materialism is the next section. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels developed a materialist science of history that proposed a systemic and radical analysis of society in the sense that it sought to provide a holistic view of every aspect of social life while going to the root causes behind them in order to identify how they can be transformed. Historical materialism, therefore, and I'm going to put these two words in the chat just because they are words that some people might not be immediately familiar with. Historical materialism should be distinguished from empiricism and idealism. Empiricism presumes that knowledge and truth come from the external world, the world out there, whereas idealism assumes that truth and knowledge are products of the human mind and come from inside human consciousness in some way. This is founded on a divide between mind and world, or between human beings and the natural world, that is fundamentally undialectical. Because empiricism and idealism overlook the very important fact that human beings are not isolated minds, but they are historically constituted beings that emerge in a material world that they then strive to try and understand, and that their experience of the world has already been forged by the deep history of material social relations. Dialectics, in this sense, simply means that there is no rigid opposition between world and mind, because human beings are enmeshed in and woven out of a concrete world which they help produce. Simply put, we are the makers of our own worlds, but not in circumstances of our own choosing, as of course Marx wrote in various formulations in his own writings. This is the core, if you will, of historical materialism, and it means that nothing is eternal, fixed, or unchanging, including systems like capitalism, the patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, etc. Dialectics is the next section. Dialectics, as I just briefly mentioned, is a way of overcoming rigid abstract conceptualizations, such as mind and world, by recognizing that the material universe is in a constant state of becoming and interaction, which is irreducible to our categories of understanding, right? The world is more complex, the material world is more complex than our conceptual categories, categories like fascism or liberalism, for instance. We need to come to terms with the fact that the world is in movement and that our static concepts are poor tools of analysis and always inadequate to the complexities of this material universe. As Lenin explained, quote, "The actual unfolding of the class struggle is infinitely richer than the most advanced theory," end quote. A second feature of dialectics is highlighted by Stalin in his short book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, where he writes, "The dialectical method therefore holds that no phenomenon in nature can be understood if taken by itself, isolated from surrounding phenomena," end quote. It requires, thus, an analysis of the totality and systematic thinking. This overcomes the limitations of bourgeois social science, which is content to study isolated so-called empirical facts. A good example of this is the number of bourgeois studies of fascism that ignore political economy and global class struggle, and that try to isolate it from those. So what does this mean for the approach to fascism? Yakov from Boston wrote in their question, "What is our historical materialist analysis of the rise of fascism?" And it's to this that I'd now like to turn. Fascism is not simply a brute fact of human existence with a set of fixed attributes that could be defined once and for all as if it were a so-called natural phenomenon, like H2O. Right? This would be an empiricist approach. It is also not the manifestation of a unified idea or doctrine with a series of essential features. This would be an idealist approach. Instead, it is a material social practice that is historical through and through, meaning that it is a process that takes on different forms at various points in time, and that therefore requires precise materialist analysis. This analysis needs to deal both with the concrete practices affiliated with fascism and their theoretical articulation, as we'll see. This opposition between empiricism and idealism on the one hand, and materialism on the other hand, I should have done that differently because materialism is to the left of idealism and empiricism, allows us to distinguish between the two major poles of ideological class struggle in theory, which can be clearly seen in the case of fascism. The bourgeois concept of fascism, which can take on either empiricist or idealist forms, seeks to singularize it as an idiosyncratic phenomenon, as something exceptional that perhaps only occurred once in history, such as in Europe in the interwar period when it rose to power in Italy and then in Germany. This approach to fascism, which is extremely widespread in the bourgeois social sciences and the media, tends to focus on surface phenomena and superstructural or ideological elements that are severed from any scientific consideration of international political economy and global class warfare. If it be a politics of hate, a logic of us and them, a rejection of parliamentary democracy, or other such qualifiers, the bourgeois approach to fascism is preoccupied with epiphenomenal traits at the expense of the social totality. It is the latter, however, that gives these traits, when they do in fact exist in some capacity, their precise meaning and function. In this regard, I'll move ahead over this, but the bourgeois concept of fascism is often linked, of course, to the bourgeois practical response to fascism, which consists in shoring up the so-called resistance by, buying consumer products for the professional managerial class like the New York Times and engaging in a kind of orientation that doesn't actually take the political economy seriously. In contrast, though, and more importantly, the historical materialist approach to fascism proposes an analysis of the social totality and examines how particular ideologies are rooted in phases of capitalist accumulation, meaning specific historical moments of the development of capitalism and stages of class struggle. This analysis can and should take place at different scales. For the purposes of this four-part series, I will distinguish between three different scales. And a lot of this, of course, comes from, if you're familiar with the writings of Antonio Gramsci or the kind of Gramscian heritage, the conjunctural, the structural, and the systemic. The conjunctural level of analysis, to start with, focuses on a particular time and place. This is where we will begin by examining the specificity of what some scholars call classical fascism, meaning the form that fascism took when it emerged in the conjuncture of interwar Europe, particularly in Italy and Germany. However, unlike the bourgeois history of fascism, which tends to isolate this conjuncture from a structural phase of capitalist class warfare, and ultimately from the systemic history of capital, we will then undertake an examination of how this form of conjunctural fascism relates to the structural scale of analysis, by which I mean the historical phase of early 20th century capitalism. This will allow us, more specifically, to relate the conjuncture of interwar Europe to the conjuncture of Jim Crow America, thereby shedding light on American fascism in the early 20th century, which echoes, of course, the great statement made by Robeson and breaks with the ideology of fascist exceptionalism. This structural level of analysis is particularly important because there are many similarities and a few differences between the structural phase of capitalism that produced fascism 100 years ago and the current structural phase. And of course, later in the series, this is one of the things that we're going to be interested in, is what's going on now and how much does it map onto or differentiate itself from what happened 100 years ago, approximately. Finally, the broadest scale of analysis is the capitalist world system. As historical materialists like Aimé Césaire and Domenico Losordo have argued, the barbarism of the Nazis should be understood as a specific manifestation of the long and deep history of colonial butchery, which has brought capitalism to every corner of the globe. If there is something exceptional about Nazism, Césaire claimed in the text that I hope you all had a chance to read, it is that concentration camps were being built in Europe instead of in the colonies. In this way, he invited us to situate the conjunctural and structural scales of analysis within a systemic framework, meaning one that accounts for the entire global history of capitalism. Historical materialists approach fascism then in such a way that a multi-scalar analysis of the social totality allows us to demonstrate how the conjunctural specificity of interwar European fascism can best be understood as nested within a structural phase of capitalist class warfare in the early 20th century, and ultimately within the deeper systemic history of capital, which came into the world in the words that Karl Marx used to describe primitive accumulation, quote, dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt, end quote. As one scales out from the conjunctural to the structural to the systemic, the precise account and operative definition of fascism can change because the material variables involved also change, and some have therefore preferred to restrict the term fascism to its conjunctural manifestations. And this can at times be useful for the sake of clarity, as we'll see. However, even if this latter tactic is used, meaning even if one takes the example of classical fascism in Europe as a touchstone for discussions of fascism, a full analysis of fascism within the social totality ultimately requires an integrated account in which it is recognized that the conjunctural is situated within the structural and within the systemic. Fascism, as a practice, is a product of the capitalist system, whose precise forms vary depending on the structural phase of capitalist development and the specific socio-historical conjuncture. The next section that I'd like to turn to is a conjunctural analysis of so-called classical fascism. So historically speaking, we know that the term fascism or fascismo in Italian emerged as a description of Mussolini's particular brand of organizing. But, and this is important, it was only theorized gradually in fits and starts. What this means is that it did not appear on the scene as a doctrine or a coherent political ideology that was then implemented. On the contrary, it began as a series of political actions and organizing tactics that were only after the fact consolidated into a doctrine. During this process, there were very significant changes within Italian political organizing. So for instance, early on, Italian fascism was actually largely reformist and republican in the sense that they defended the ideals of the kind of imperial republic of Italy. So republican, not like the Republican Party, but republican in the broader historical sense of a republic that is established as a kind of oligarchy in which you have the rule of the few that oversee a state apparatus and that govern the multitude. Moreover, early fascism advocated for women's suffrage. They supported some very limited pro-labor reforms. They feuded with the Catholic Church, and they were not openly racist or anti-Semitic, right? All of these, of course, I highlight because as the movement moved into and became consolidated into a doctrine, they would turn their backs on a lot of the issues that I just highlighted. So it was only after the fascist movement had evolved and began to gain power that Mussolini and others attempted to consolidate it into a clear, coherent doctrine. Mussolini himself, if you had a chance to look at the doctrine of fascism that was in the additional readings, claimed that, quote, fascism was not the nursling of a doctrine previously drafted at a desk. It was born of the need of action and was action. It was not a party, but in the first 2 years, an anti-party and a movement, end quote. This is one of the reasons that Claudia and I wanted to include the reading by Jose Carlos Mariátegui, who was in Italy during the the rise of fascism, and provided, in my opinion, one of the most insightful and fine-grained analyses of the internal struggles going on in the first years or the early years of the fascist movement. One of the things that he pointed out is that the fascist movement, before becoming consolidated within the state, was actually torn between two extremes. On the one hand, there was a kind of reactionary right-wing faction, and on the other hand, there was a reformist camp that aligned itself more on conservative bourgeois politics, and it even had certain liberal leanings. According to Mariátegui's analysis, what Mussolini did in these early years is he straddled the two extremes, the kind of liberal reformist and the reactionary right-wing extreme. But he was no longer able to maintain that polarization when in 1924, the fascists assassinated the socialist politician Giacomo Matteotti. And that assassination led to an internal crisis in the fascist movement. And Mussolini had a problem on his hands because the two factions were becoming more and more polarized. He extended an olive branch to the liberal, the more conservative institutionalized form of fascism that they rebuked. And then he decided to go with the right-wing faction, which was which really brought then fascism to a fever pitch. He came out and claimed basically responsibility for the Matteotti assassination. And it's at that point in time that there's a kind of authoritarian, sharp rightward turn on the part of the Italian fascists. What this means then, from the point of view of historical materialists, is that from its inception, the concept of fascism has been a site of ideological struggle. If it be the clash between the extremists and the reformists within the fascist camp, or more generally, between the fascists and liberals within the capitalist camp, and the communists and certain of the socialists within the anti-capitalist camp. So rather than fascism being something like a transhistorical doctrine or an idea in the sky, which an idealist approach would surmise, or a brute fact of the world, according to empiricism, it is a concept and practice that is a very important site of class struggle. So when Mussolini and the fascist intellectual Giovanni Gentile came to define the doctrine of fascism in 1932, they identified the following attributes. The reason that these attributes are important is not because they somehow deliver us an account of the true nature of fascism, as some bourgeois theorists presume, but rather that the self-understanding of these important actors in the fascist movement sheds light on fascism as a general social phenomenon. Here are some of the primary features that they identified. And this is not in particular like a particular order. First, fascism contains a spiritual view of life, meaning that it has a mystical quality that is capable of transcending the individual and, quote, raising him to conscious membership of a spiritual society. It insists, therefore, on the importance of tradition. They write that man is man only by virtue of the spiritual process to which he contributes as a member of the family, the social group, and the nation, right? So this spiritual project links the individual to the family, to the state. Secondly, and this overlaps with the first point, of course, fascism rejects individualism and insists on the central role of the state. Mussolini and Gentile write, the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of a people, right? So there's the absolute primacy of the state, understood as a spiritual force. Thirdly, fascism, of course, rejects socialism and Marxism. They say in this document, such a conception of life makes fascism the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism. There were a few questions in the people who registered about horseshoe theory and the attempt to take the extreme right wing of capitalism, which some will identify as fascism, with the extreme left wing of communism and say, oh, well, the two extremes are like the ends of a horseshoe and they're actually really close. And we know this due to the kind of dominant ideological logic of totalitarianism. This, of course, is pure pap. It's an invented ideology in order to suggest that the opposites are actually somehow close to one another. And the fascists themselves knew this because they killed communists and because they themselves, according to their own doctrine, were very clear about what their project was. Next, fascism rejects peace and pacifism. So imperialism is inscribed within the fascist project. The next major point that they highlight is that fascism rejects parliamentary democracy as a sham and a fraud. Now, this is important in 1932, that there's a turn away from parliamentary democracy after state power has been consolidated, right? Mussolini did not say this in his early years because they used the parliamentary mechanism in order to build the fascist movement. And I'll get to that in a moment. But once they consolidated power, then they turned back against it. Lastly, there's a vision of the fascist future. Quote, granted that the 19th century was the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy, this does not mean that the 20th century must also be the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy. Political doctrines pass, nations remain. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a fascist century, end quote. So another very important part of the fascist project in Italy was that it's what Michael Parenti calls a false revolution. It often used the pageantry and even some of the discourse and some of the symbols of revolutionary politics, but it recuperated them for a pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, ultra-nationalist project. So if we bring this all together for at least a preliminary working definition of fascism in the conjunctural form that it took in Italy, and I'll say in a moment how this relates to Germany, we could say that fascism is understood as an ultra-nationalist, imperialist, anti-communist, and anti-democratic politics of radical rejuvenation, within which a strong state with an authoritarian leader mobilizes sectors of civil society in a spiritual project of national renewal. Right, so it's ultra-nationalist, imperialist, anti-communist, anti-democratic. There's a strong state with an authoritarian leader who mobilizes sectors of civil society in this spiritual project of renewal. Now, these features also largely apply to Nazi Germany, which of course rose to prominence in the 1930s, kind of in the wake of and after Italian fascism had made certain gains. Although there are some slight differences that could be highlighted, I'll just point to one. Ideologically, for instance, the Nazis established an explicitly racist project modeled on US racist statecraft, which we'll get to later, that targeted first the removal and then the elimination of members of what they called the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. Very important terminology, right? Because the assault on the Jewish population was understood in part as a racialization of communists. Part of this was because a lot of European Jews were actually, I think it's the overwhelming majority of them were situated in the Soviet Union. And so there was an affiliation between Judaism and the Eastern barbarians who had made a communist revolution, right? So this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy was a big part of it because the Nazis blamed it for trying to destroy Western civilization with its pillars of capitalism, Christianity, and white supremacy. In fact, there's a really fascinating quote that I was just looking at this morning that is from the commander-in-chief von Reichenau, who was the field marshal of the in German high command. He said, the most essential aim of the war, of World War II, against the Jewish Bolshevistic system is a complete destruction of their means of power and the elimination of Asiatic influence from the European culture, right? So this is a racialized war on the threat to capitalist society in Europe. What this means, if we take our coordinates from this kind of working definition, is that fascism understood in this sense is not like traditional conservatism. Most traditional conservatism works through electoral politics and maintains the kind of constitutional state and the parameters of bourgeois democracy. Nor should it be confused with authoritarianism if we understand by authoritarianism a state project that does not mobilize civil society as either the vigilantes or the parastate supporters of a particular state project. So many will distinguish between authoritarianism and fascism by saying that the main difference is that fascism does mobilize certain sectors of civil society, like the petty bourgeoisie, certain sectors of the lumpen proletariat, some workers, etc. Whereas authoritarianism, some people will call it fascism from above, because it's the state power using military and police to crush movements from below. in situations such as some of the dictatorships in Latin America, where the left was so strong that it was impossible to organize fascist bands in the way that they'd been organized in Italy and Germany. We'll come back to some of these definitions because ultimately, and this is why I wanted to start with insisting on a dialectical approach, ultimately these concepts aren't pure concepts that carve the social world at its joints. They are just tools of analysis. And so in Italy, like in Germany, the beginning point of the fascist movements was very much based on mobilizing sectors of society for the fascist project. But once it became consolidated as a state project, certain of the more left-leaning, I'll put this in quotes, elements from the fascist bands were actually crushed. And what remained was incorporated within the state apparatus. So some people will talk of a kind of authoritarian turn on the part of these fascist movements themselves. I just want to highlight that at the outset. The next section that I have is on liberalism and fascism. Liberalism, I'll be using here, of course, as many Marxists use it, not to refer to like Democrats as opposed to Republicans who would be conservative, but instead the political philosophy and political history of the system of liberalism. And what we mean by that is the system that emerged beginning in the 17th century, but became really consolidated in the 19th century. And it's a system of rule in which there exists, in principle, a neutral state apparatus that is supposed to guarantee the equal rights of every citizen, right? This is the system we have in the US and a lot of Europe, et cetera. It's based on a distinction between the supposed private rights of the citizens to pursue their own interests and the supposed neutrality of the state apparatus. Now, according to the dominant ideology, it's liberalism, not communism, that is the last bulwark against fascism. Because liberalism represents the rule of law in the face of these aberrant and malevolent demagogues who could take over and destroy this system. Now, this framing of the relationship between liberalism and fascism not only presents them as opposites, but it also defines the essence of the fight against fascism as the fight for liberalism. And the problem with that is that it cuts out of the history of fascism the relationship to the liberal state apparatus. So within Western Europe and that specific conjunction, it is extremely important to recognize that Italian fascism and Nazism emerge within parliamentary democracies rather than conquering them from the outside. These were not coups d'etat, they were not seizures of state power. They rose to power through the electoral mechanisms, and they rose to power in a very specific historical situation that explains part of their importance to the general population. One of the reasons for this rise to power was, of course, the economic crisis in the capitalist world that was marked by the Great Depression of the early 1930s, but also the fact that there was the world's first successful socialist revolution in 1917 in the Soviet Union. So the capitalist world was in material and ideological crisis, and everyone on the world stage recognized that there was an alternative to this material and ideological crisis of capitalism, and that was the communist alternative. Mussolini, as he rose to power, was backed by big industrial capitalists and bankers because of his anti-worker, pro-capitalist political orientation, right? So Mussolini, like the Nazis that I'll get to in a second, worked within the parliamentary system by mobilizing powerful financial supporters to bankroll an expensive propaganda campaign while his black shirts rode roughshod over picket lines and working class organizations, right? So bourgeois democracy, right, by which we understand a pseudo-democracy in which capital ultimately oversees the electoral mechanisms, is the framework within which Mussolini and Hitler both rose to power. In October of 1922, it was the magnates in the Confederation of Industry and major bank leaders that provided the millions necessary for the March on Rome. These were the business leaders. It was the corporatocracy that funded the March on Rome. Mussolini's famous March on Rome, which was nothing more than a spectacular show of force. It was political theater. And that being said, when he arrived in Rome, he did not seize power. On the contrary, and this is why I wanted you to read the Daniel Guérin, as he explained, what you read, hopefully, is a small part of a much larger study called Fascism and Big Business that I couldn't recommend more strongly. Mussolini was summoned by the king on October 29th and was, according to parliamentary norms, entrusted with forming a cabinet. The capitalist state turned itself over without a fight. But Mussolini, and this is another important part of this story, was intent on forming an absolute majority in parliament with the help of the liberals. And the liberals in Italy supported his new electoral law in July 1923, and then made a joint slate with the fascists. Yes, you heard me correctly. The liberals made a joint slate with the fascists for the election on April 6, 1924. The fascists, who had only had 35 seats in parliament, gained 286 seats with the help of the liberals. Comrade Buddha from Silva asked about how fascism relates to capital, and this is a very important part of this story, right? As we'll see in the case of the Nazi rise to power, which followed in many ways the same pattern that I just outlined in Italy. It worked within the parliamentary system by courting the favor of big industrial magnates and bankers. And by big industrial capital, I mean the capital behind the coal, oil, steel, the automotive industries, right? All of the industries that could and eventually did profit from the permanent war economy that was instigated. It is these industrial magnates and bankers that provided the financial support necessary to grow the Nazi Party from a fringe party and allow it to eventually secure the electoral victory of September 1930. There's a great speech by Hitler on October 19th, 1935, in which he explains what it meant for his party to have the material resources and financial backing necessary to support 1,000 Nazi orators with their own cars, who could hold some 100,000 public meetings in the course of a year, right? This is how they rose to power. In the December 1932 election, the Social Democrat leaders, who were far to the left, of course, of contemporary liberals or the DSA, but shared a reformist political agenda, refused to form an 11th hour coalition with the communists against Nazism. As Michael Parenti has pointed out, as in many other countries past and present, so in Germany, this is a quote, the Social Democrats would sooner ally themselves with the reactionary right than make common cause with the Reds, end quote. Prior to the election, the Communist Party candidate, Ernst Thälmann, had argued for a vote for the conservative Field Marshal von Hindenburg amounted to a vote for Hitler and a vote for war. And he was ultimately right, because only weeks after Hindenburg's election, it was Hindenburg, according to parliamentary norms, who invited Hitler to become chancellor. Fascism in both cases then rose to power through bourgeois parliamentary democracy, in which big capital bankrolled the candidates who would do its bidding while also creating a populist spectacle, right? A false revolution that marshaled and suggested mass appeal. Its conquest of power took place within this legal and constitutional framework, which secured its apparent legitimacy on the home front, as well as within the international community of bourgeois democracies, right? The bourgeois democracies of the Western world in particular. Once its power was secure, however, fascism revealed its more authoritarian face, transforming itself into a kind of military-style dictatorship. It unflinchingly set about, and in Italy, this process was much, much slower than in Germany. But in both cases, they set about completing the task that they were hired to accomplish by crushing organized labor, eradicating opposition parties, destroying independent publications, putting a halt to elections, scapegoating and eventually eliminating racialized underclasses, privatizing public assets, launching projects of colonial expansion, right? Both Italy and Germany were colonial endeavors, and investing heavily in a war economy beneficial to its industrial supporters. in establishing the direct dictatorship of big capital. It even destroyed some of the more plebeian and populist elements in its own ranks and crushed a number of very confused liberals under the juggernaut of repressive class warfare. It's important to note in this regard that there's a remarkable difference then between fascist movements and fascist states. And that as the movement gained power within the bourgeois democracy, it had a very different face than when it actually consolidated that power and used it, and used the full state, the full power of the state to crush its opponents. Moreover, I should note that the first enemies, of course, of the Nazis were the communists. The first people who were killed and rounded up in the concentration camps prior to the final solution against the Jewish population were the communists. And there's a lot of documented information on this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. There were a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. I just want to let folks know that if we don't, by any chance, have the capacity to answer questions today, have enough faith to know that we will do our best to answer them throughout the course. We are keeping track of the chat, and we will download it and look over it just to make sure that we are able to answer the questions to the best of our capacity. I also want to encourage folks to continue to do what you all have been doing, which is a very comradely thing of being able to answer each other's questions, and have been doing a great job in doing so too, because part of this again is the collective construction of knowledge and being able to share what we know. So thank you all for that. Gabriel, you want to start with some of the questions that you were able to look at?
Some of them maybe I'll deal with just very quickly, because they're issues that we're going to return to. The question of the relationship between fascism and parastate operators, and by parastate people just mean, right, there's the state apparatus, and then para just means alongside, so all of the forces alongside the state. So like vigilante organizations, organized crime, this would all be parastate actors. And a big part of the fascist project is mobilizing parastate actors, vigilantes, the mafia and whatnot. And it's absolutely true that the national security state of the United States, but also of other capitalist countries, has been very involved in mobilizing these types of actors. We're going to talk about that a little later on, so I think we can put that question off for a later session. There was a question about epiphenomenal traits, and just to clarify what I meant by this is that a lot of accounts of fascism tend to look at simply its immediate face in either the media or in the political theater that's given to us by the capitalist ruling class. And so people presume that, well, a fascist is just a particular person or somebody who talks a particular way. And that doesn't go to the root of fascism, because the fascist leaders that we've had historically are ones who are supported by an entire political economy and by material forces that promote them. And so if you're just looking at the leaders and the mean things that they say, or, you know, things along those lines, you're not actually going to the root problem. And so by epiphenomenal, I simply meant that, the kind of ideological traits that don't mine down into the political economy that's driving some of these developments. The question of fascism and racialization, I think, is really important. It's something that if other people want to weigh in on this, I'd be more than happy to hear them on. It's in part because I've become very interested in how the very logic of the Nazi war machine was a continuation of the imperialist intervention into the Soviet Union in 1918 to 1920, and that the 14 capitalist countries who participated in that and were not able to strangle the Bolshevik babe in its crib, according to the statement that Winston Churchill made, the Nazi war machine continued that project, right? That was part of the point of all of the capitalist funding that went into the Nazi war machine. And so that project of anti-communism segues very much with a racialization of communists as part of this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that's related to, of course, the number of Marxists who came from a Jewish background, and then a certain affiliation between godless communism, Jewish theology on the one hand, and then Christianity on the other, and the belief in God and ultimately the God of capital. As well. Claudia, were there any questions that really jumped out to you? Sorry, I'm kind of looking at this as we go through, but if any interpolated you more than others, please let me know.
I think more than a question, Brian can intervene now.
Oh,
he
yeah,
made
great.
some good points that I think folks should listen to. So Brian, would you be down to share with us?
One of the things that was most characteristic about Germany and Italy was that both societies were in crises. Both societies, interwar Europe was in crisis, but Germany and Italy in particular were in crisis. In the case of Germany, inflation was through the roof. The Versailles Treaty, the conditions that were imposed on Germany after its defeat in World War I meant the country was basically sanctioned, and something had to be done. There was an unresolved crisis in Germany, and the Social Democratic Party was very strong. In 1910, the Social Democrats constituted 1/3 of the entire parliamentary delegation in the German parliament, the Reichstag. They had 110 members out of just over 300. And the Communist Party, after the Russian Revolution, which split from the Social Democrats, was also huge. As a matter of fact, in the last election in 1932, the last election before Hitler is named chancellor by Hindenburg, and as Gabriel said, this was the bourgeois right. Hindenburg was not part of the fascist movement, and the Social Democrats had even in the second round of voting in 32, as a way to stop Hitler, had told its members, vote for Hindenburg, he's the lesser evil. And then Hindenburg appointed Hitler to be chancellor. And thus Hitler becomes in charge of the state in short order, and then liquidates the Social Democrats and the communists, liquidates them literally. But in that last election in 1932, the combined vote between the Social Democrats and the communists was larger than the fascist vote. It was about 13 million compared to about 12 million. The Nazi vote had gained exponentially in the years, after it had been a tiny minority in 28, 29, but still it was outnumbered by the Social Democrats and the communists. So there was a crisis in German society, German capitalism. That crisis could only be resolved through socialist revolution or through the complete fascist regimentation of the labor movement. And the industrialists and the bankers who Gabriel talked about, they finally decide to opt for Hitler and the Nazis when they realize that the Nazis are willing and prove themselves in street fighting to use unfettered levels of violence to destroy the left. And so the bourgeoisie, which didn't really prefer the Nazis, felt they were the only sort of extreme solution to resolve the social crisis in Germany that was not the extreme solution of communism. And so they opt out, they decide to throw their weight for Hitler. And that's when Hitler becomes brought in through vis-a-vis the parliamentary channel. And Gabriel mentioned, and I'll finish here, that the Social Democrats were so anti-communist that they refused to make a bloc with the communists. But the communists also had adopted an ultra-left political orientation such that they described the Social Democrats, because they weren't revolutionaries, and the only thing that would save German society from its crisis was revolution. They said, because the Social Democrats are not revolutionary, but they command a big support within the German working class, they are in fact a bloc to the socialist revolution, and as such, they are greasing the wheels for fascism. So the CP said the Social Democrats are nothing more than social fascists. Now, this is a really important ultra-left tactic, because if you're in a factory and you've got, 40 of the workers are communists and 50 of them are social democrats, and the communists are saying to the social democratic workers, hey, you're just social fascists, you can't build a united front against fascism. You can't call people fascists and then expect them to be in a united front. So there was a squandering of an important tactical moment, a critical moment in 32 and in the beginning of 33 that allows the bourgeoisie basically to peacefully give over to the Nazis the state power, and then the Nazis do their thing, all of which, the rest of which we know as the history. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that caveat in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. There, again, a lot of questions, but I think it would be good if we could address this question around imperialism and its connection to fascism that was raised on the chat, and then also the questions around the generalized mass character of fascism. So I think those are two questions that are key for this moment. Not to say the other ones aren't, but I think the other ones will be addressed again throughout the course. We'll make space for that.
Yeah, and thank you. Oh yes, I am unmuted. Thank you, Brian, for that comment. In fact, one of the things that I want to do in the session next week is to look at the logic of social fascism, how it was constituted, and the debates within the basically European and Soviet Union organizing circles, and tease out some of the specificities of that with the left opposition and other such things. So thank you for bringing that up. It's something we definitely want to mine down into. Regarding the mass character of fascism, one of the claims that has been made by some Marxist analysts, and here I'm thinking in particular of a book by Andre Gunder Frank called Crisis in the Third World, is that the specific character of classical fascism in the European sense mobilized a base because of a number of factors, some of which were that the disorganized hard left within Europe that Brian was just referencing meant that some were very disappointed by the Social Democrats, some were also disappointed by the communists, and that the kind of disarray of the left, the economic crisis, and given the fact that Italy was a kind of peripheral capitalist country, Germany's economy had suffered so much after World War I, that there was a population that could be mobilized through extensive propaganda campaigns for a kind of project of national renewal. When you compare that to Latin America, and I saw in the chat there's a number of questions about Pinochet or Argentina or other countries that have been subjected to various forms of a dictatorship, Andre Gunder Frank has made the argument that I personally find quite convincing, that in those cases, the workers' movements were so strong and powerful that it was very difficult, if not impossible, for the capitalist ruling class to organize sections of civil society like they had done in Europe. And so instead, they used a top-down form of state authoritarianism that was based or I'm sorry, that was backed by the global watchdog of capitalism, the US administration, with all of the power of the national security state. And so some people will talk about top-down fascism in the case of Latin America versus a bottom-up fascism that you saw in the classical cases in Europe, or authoritarianism in Latin America versus fascism in Europe. Of course, though, once you get into the details, it's a little bit more complicated. Insofar as in Europe, we saw that there was an authoritarian turn. And of course, there have been death squads throughout Latin America. And those death squads sometimes wear uniforms. Sometimes they do not, right? So I don't think that there are really hard and fast distinctions here. Instead, we have to look at the specificity of the particular situation. Regarding imperialism, it is very important that both Italy and Germany were colonial, the fascist movements were colonial endeavors that were focused on imperialist expansion. In the case of Germany, this was much more explicit, and also Germany had a lot more power, of course, military power, financial power than Italy did. And Germany was looking for what they referred to as, and this is, I'll just put it in the chat, Lebensraum, which in German simply means living space. And they developed this concept of needing more living space and needing to extend to the east, that in the exact same way that the US empire in its early colonial formation had extended to the west. And so there's a whole series of parallels that are made in Nazi Germany between the western frontier that the US had conquered and the eastern frontier, meaning the frontier of the Bolsheviks, that the Nazi war machine was going to conquer. And so imperialism in these cases is inscribed into the very nature of those particular projects. Now, of course, if we relate that to Latin America, we'd have to have a much broader understanding of how imperialism driven by multinational corporations and with all of the power of the US government and national security state behind them has enacted forms of imperialism within Latin America that have, in certain cases, like the coup d'etat in Chile in 1973, looked a lot more like a kind of top-down military coup d'etat. But there are also numerous cases where those death squads are mobilized from bottom up. And in fact, one of the elements I think that is very important to study and analyze, I'll allude to this later in the seminar, is that the fascists and Nazis were not defeated in World War II. There was a military defeat, but a lot of the top brass were recuperated and actually integrated into the US imperialist war machine. And so if you look at the career of someone like Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon for having tortured to death the leader of the French resistance, Jean Moulin, amongst other things, he killed tens of thousands of people. He was then integrated into the CIA and eventually given safe passage to Latin America, where he collaborated with a lot of the dictatorial regimes in Latin America, particularly in Bolivia, and was probably involved in the CIA manhunt for Che Guevara. And so the connections between what was going on in Europe and what went on in the post-war era with the expansion of US imperialism is a very, very important part of this story. Much too complex, of course, for me to get into in any detail here, but I want people at least to be aware of those connections. What I wanted to turn to just in these final comments was two things. One of them is a kind of direct response to two comrades, Elva from Denver and Natalie from Atlanta, both in registering for the course, highlighted the following questions. I want to understand the relationship and intersection of capitalism and fascism better. And I'm very curious about early examples of fascism and how it was used as a tool to expand capitalism in its early years. Now, I touched on certain aspects of this as it relates to the national capitalists in Germany and Italy. But a big part of the story of the rise of fascism within the European context is that it wasn't only backed by the large industrialists and the bankers, as well as the landowners within Italy and Germany, but it was also supported and backed by major corporations and banks whose headquarters were in Western bourgeois democracies. American capitalism played a very big and important role in this. Henry Ford is probably the easiest example to point to, since in 1938, he was awarded the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, which was the highest honor that could be bestowed upon any non-German by the Nazi regime. Mussolini, in fact, had received one the same year. And Ford not only funneled money into the Nazi propaganda campaign, but he also provided it with much of its anti-Semitic and anti-Bolshevik ideology. In fact, James and Suzanne Poole have claimed that, quote, Ford's conviction that communism was a completely Jewish creation was shared by Hitler. And some have suggested that Hitler was so close ideologically to Henry Ford that certain passages of Mein Kampf were directly copied from Ford's anti-Semitic publication, The International Jew. But Ford was, of course, only one among many of the American companies that invested in Germany. And this included not only companies, but many of the major banks and investment firms. These banks, investment firms, and corporations profited very handsomely from the process of what's called Aryanization. And Aryanization was the expulsion of Jews from business life and the forced transfer of their property into Aryan hands, right? If those be Germans or Americans or other members of the white race who are part of the capitalist corporatocracy. The companies that invested in Germany included Ford, as I mentioned, but also International Harvester, General Motors, Standard Oil of New Jersey, DuPont of Philadelphia or the Philadelphia area, and they were deeply involved in German weapon production. In fact, Germany became one of the primary sites of US foreign direct investment in the 1930s. US investment in Germany increased by some 48.5% between 1929 and 1940, at the exact same time that it was declining elsewhere in continental Europe. Moreover, if you look at what the subsidiaries of these companies were doing in Germany, the subsidiaries of companies like Ford and General Motors, as well as several oil companies, made use of the forced labor in concentration camps. We can't forget, of course, that the concentration camps were labor camps, right? They just worked people to death, but they, some they would just eliminate immediately, those who were either judged incapable of working or refused to work. But Buchenwald provided concentration camp labor for GM's Rüsselsheim plant. The Ford truck plant was located near Cologne, and Ford's German managers made extensive use of Russian POWs for war production. Another part of this kind of international financing of capitalism, one of the reasons that I wanted to highlight this is, and this relates to one of the questions that we kind of generated behind the scenes for this class, is often when people think of fascists, they think of the kind of, pot-bellied, beer-drinking white guy with a baseball bat. They don't think of the rich prick chortling in his martini on a yacht making certain financial decisions. And one question I think we all have to think about as organizers is, what's the relationship between the fascist on the ground who pulls the trigger and the capitalists who are paying for the gun and the bullet and allowing that individual or that group of individuals to act with impunity? And so another part of this picture is the role of major foreign investment firms like Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell was run by two of the most important figures in American and I would say international politics of the 20th century, John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, who was the director of the CIA, or as he liked to say in his more whimsical moment, he was the Secretary of State for hostile states. So this was the equivalent of, a lot of people talk about a revolving door policy in which there's the corporatocracy in the government. Sullivan and Cromwell is, there's no revolving door. These are the same people. And it played a central role in the corporatocracy because it was the largest Wall Street law firm at the time. And they oversaw, advised, and managed global investments in Germany. Moreover, this was in excess of $1 billion. And then they made sure in the wake of World War II that none of the business partners of Sullivan and Cromwell were prosecuted. They were unbelievably successful as well in protecting their assets and successfully securing them, and while they avoided prosecution. This is important as well because the war against fascism, or to defeat fascism, did defeat the fascist armies. their corporate backers largely continued to act with impunity, right? And if you look at the bombing campaigns in World War II, what were targeted were workers' barracks for the most part, for the Allied bombing campaigns. And there was a lot of discussion on the hard left about why the railroads weren't being bombed, or the trains to the concentration camps, right? Or the factories. And clearly the ties to US corporate capitalist interests were a big part of that story. So what I'd like to turn to, and this would be my kind of final and concluding comments, is based on everything that we've been talking about thus far, how can we establish at least a working definition of fascism from the point of view of this kind of conjunctural analysis that we've been doing today? Now, by working definition, I do not mean a kind of rigid definition that has a set of invariable traits. On the contrary, materialists understand that concepts function like tools. And a tool has use value because it can be employed in multiple different contexts. So if you take the example of a screwdriver, if there were a different screwdriver for every single type of screw head, you'd have hundreds of screwdrivers and spend more time looking for the perfect fit than getting any work done. So a standard size screwdriver is remarkably useful, precisely because it can be successfully employed in so many different cases, right? My point is that it does not need to fit absolutely perfectly in order to get the job done. And this is exactly how a working definition functions. It is a definition that works because it gives us purchase over multiple phenomena. In this regard, of course, I'll just maybe note quickly that this depends on the scale of the analysis. So if you were to be a general contractor, having one screwdriver would work. If you're a robotics specialist, you might want 10 or 15 different types of screwdrivers. Meaning that if you look at Italian fascism and its inner workings, you might want to tease some different things out. But if you scale out and look at the classical formulation of fascism, you can establish one working definition that cuts across them, right? In this regard, a working definition of interwar fascism that will help us then examine American fascism and other manifestations globally in the coming sessions, I think needs to account for the following factors. I'll point out four. One is the context. The other is the core fascist project. The third is the methods. And the fourth is the ideology. So if we begin with the context, we mentioned this briefly, but I want to go into a little bit more detail. This fascism emerged as a reaction to the threat of the Russian Revolution. And we should know that there was an attempted communist revolution in Germany that ultimately failed in 1918 and 1919, and that the Italian labor movement was defeated in 1920, right? So this is a context of extreme revolutionary class struggle in which the Soviet Union had succeeded, but the revolutions did not follow in the capitalist Western world. Clara Zetkin, of course, claimed, and I'll just quote her here quickly, she claimed that fascism arrives much more as punishment because the proletariat has not carried and driven forward the revolution that began in Russia, right? So this failure on the part of the German Communist Party and the Italian labor movement is an important part of that. A second aspect to this context is the reaction of the capitalist class to the threats of socialism, but also to the Great Depression. I mentioned this earlier, but Italy was considered a kind of peripheral capitalist country. Germany had its economy wrecked, but moreover, Italy and Germany were both latecomers to the colonial feast that had enriched so many Western European countries like France, Spain, and UK. So a lot of the fascist ideology was about also opening up colonial frontiers of warfare in order to increase capitalist accumulation for Germany and Italy. Contextually then, capitalism was facing a dual crisis, an ideological crisis due to the historical emergence of a real socialist alternative, and an infrastructural or economic crisis due to the Great Depression and the recognition that the capitalist system was not working for the majority of humanity. If we relate this then to the core project of fascism as we see it emerging within at least the European context, one key aspect to this is that it was a project on the part of the capitalist ruling class and specifically big industrial capital, to crush the communist threat and increase capitalist accumulation. This project of crushing the threat and increasing capitalist accumulation through colonial expansion was based on a mobilization of war veterans, the unemployed, the petty bourgeoisie, some workers, those who had been disenfranchised and were suffering economically and were ideologically, unmoored from the organizing of the communists. What this means then is that there was a certain form of cross-class alliance in a specific sense. Fascism had financial backers and was driven by the capitalist ruling class. There were militants in the streets, right, who were brawling with communists, who were burning down communist headquarters, breaking picket lines, etc. But there were also, and this is an important part of the fascist project, there were non-violent active supporters, like voters, who were voting for the fascists or for the fascist slates. And there were also the passive supporters who complacently acquiesced, right? This is what one of the songs that Claudia played was referencing. This is why it's important to analyze fascism as a social totality and to see all of these different sectors of the population. Moreover, part of the core project of fascism was then one of taking over the state through the mechanisms of bourgeois democracy, right? This is one of the reasons that Gramsci theorized fascism as a passive revolution. It wasn't an active revolution because there was not a coup d'etat. It used the state and slowly took over it, but then instigated a revolution in the sense that it was a radical transformation, not a change, obviously, in social class formation, but a radical transformation in using the state power to break with some of the limits that had been set by bourgeois democracies. And once state power was consolidated, of course, there was the crushing of the workers' movement and the launching of colonial wars of conquest. Now, the methods of the fascists in the European context included, and I think this is a big part of the picture, mass communication and the mobilization of contemporary forms of technology, in particular the radio, amplified speeches, newspapers, and film as propaganda networks to mobilize those sectors of civil society who could be brought into their particular project. Of course, if we relate this to the 21st century, we see the internet and digital modes of communication, social media, et cetera, playing a parallel role in certain regards. There is also, at the level of methods, a certain attempt to aestheticize politics, as Walter Benjamin argued, meaning that there's a pageantry, there's public festivals, the uniforms, the marching, the fascist architecture, the imperial style, fascist art for that matter. And all of this went into constructing a kind of false revolution, right? Stealing the signifiers of radical change, but using them to intensify the status quo of capitalist accumulation. Finally, regarding the ideology, we've seen some of this, but just trying to consolidate these different points. It was anti-communist through and through, and it was a class ideology that was a racist ideology because it was against the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. It was also an ultra-nationalist ideology. This was white supremacy, of course, in the case of Germany, and the scapegoating of the Judeo-Bolsheviks, as well as foreigners, the disabled, queers, those who are identified as dissolute and asocial, like the homeless, etc. And it was invested in a colonial ideology of needing Lebensraum, of living space for the expansion of the Aryan race. In fact, I would touch very briefly, one of the questions that I did see is on the role of women. And I did want to just address this really quickly because both in Italy and in Germany, there was a real insistence on the correct role of women. Women were there as the social reproducers of, in particularly in the case of Germany, the Aryan race, and they played a central role in the social cement of family life. So the proper role of the woman was to be in the domestic sphere, overseeing the birth of the new, the next generation of soldiers for the Aryan armies, in short. So there was a very explicit theorization and practical engagement with, quote unquote, the women's question, but of course it was consolidating women within the logic of racial superiority and the sphere of domesticity as being the sphere where women should be consigned. So if we bring all of these different threads together, I think that the best definition, working definition we can have of fascism is that it arose in the threatening wake of the Russian Revolution and later the Great Depression in the capitalist world as a project of mobilizing mass communications and propaganda to slowly but surely mobilize sectors of civil society, particularly the petty bourgeoisie, with the backing of big industrial capitalists around a nationalist and colonial ideology of radical transformation in order to crush the workers' movement and launch wars of colonial conquest. It's at this level of analysis, and I might close here, or I could add some additional comments depending on whether or not we want. I see a lot of questions coming in the chat. It's at this level of the analysis that I think the words of Michael Parenti should be cited. He claims in his great book, Black Shirts and Reds, he says, fascism is, quote, nothing more than the final solution to class struggle. The totalistic submergence and exploitation of democratic forces for the benefit and profit of higher financial circles. Fascism is a false revolution.
Well, thank you, Gabriel, for that. And thank you everyone for your engagement and the questions and the comments. We hope that we continue to be as engaged and the chat continues to move as quickly as it did today. We've explored the historical context, the methods, the ideology and characteristics of fascism. Next week, we will cover communist responses to fascism. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are happy and excited about our next 3 more weeks together. Thank you so much.